In 1832, the United States Navy bought 12 compasses from a Boston sailmaker. In 1839, the United States Navy broke every one of them with a sledgehammer in the open courtyard of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. In the 7 years in between, those 12 compasses were carried aboard the Constitution, the Constellation, and the United States, and the surviving log entries of all 3 frigates record them holding their bearings in heavy weather, where the standard ship's compasses ran wild. The official reason for the destruction, recorded in the department's correspondence, was obsolescence. The British, the Secretary's office noted, were producing superior designs. The British were not. The man who built the compasses, a sailmaker named Charles Grafton, working alone in an upstairs loft off Long Wharf, with 3 glass vials of refined quicksilver and a small piece of figured brass he called the differential plate, was dead within 16 months of the destruction, in a boarding house in Mexico City, of causes the local authorities described as consistent with violence. The patent drawing is gone. The bench is gone. The hand that prepared the vials is gone. What survives is the Navy procurement file of 1832, the destruction order of March 1839, and the 7 years of routine log entries from 3 frigates that record the instrument doing, in foul weather, what the standard issue of its service could not. This is the story of those 12 compasses. It is also, in a smaller and harder-to-look-at way, the story of how a working naval instrument that performed in front of its using officers for 7 years was, in a deliberate institutional act, taken away from those officers and broken beyond reconstruction, and how the man who knew how to build it died alone in a foreign city 16 months later. The morning of the 14th of November, 1835, on the deck of the Constitution, as she worked out of a 3-day storm off Cape Hatteras and into a cold, flat dawn, is one place to begin. The standard compass on her binnacle had been swinging through 40 degrees of arc through the worst of the storm. The Grafton compass beside it, by the officer of the deck's penciled note in her log, had held its bearing within 2 points of north for the duration. There are 7 similar entries in her surviving logs between 1833 and 1838, and there are similar entries in the logs of the other 2 frigates that carried her sister units. The man who built them, or who is, at any rate, named in the procurement file as having built them, and to whom the public record attaches the patent of 1831 and the death notice of 1840, did not live to give evidence about them. I have to be honest at the outset that Charles Grafton is a name that survives now mainly in the Navy's procurement correspondence and in the brief Boston newspaper notices of the period, and that he has left almost no other documentary track. There is a tradition in some popular accounts that the name itself is a Boston shorthand for an inventor whose real surname does not appear in the city directories. I cannot settle that here. I will use the name the procurement file uses, with the understanding that what we are tracking is the figure attached to that file by the Navy of the 1830s, whoever, behind the name, that figure actually was. Charles Grafton, by the name in the file, appears in the Boston City Directory for 1828 as a sailmaker on a small street off the harbor, with a workshop on the upper floor of a wooden building that no longer stands. He had been at sea, by the brief biographical note in the directory, for 1831, for the better part of his early life. First as a foremast hand, then as a sailmaker's apprentice on a Liverpool packet. Then, back in Boston, building suits of canvas for the merchant fleet. He had no formal training in physics. He had no membership of any learned society. What he had, by every account that survives of him, was a slow, methodical way with his hands, and a habit of taking small things apart and putting them back together at his bench in the long evenings. The first reference to his compass work in the Boston papers is from the autumn of 1830. A short paragraph in the Boston Daily Advertiser of October 12th notes that Mr. Grafton, of the Loft off Long Wharf, has been showing to merchant captains in port a mariner's compass of his own construction, said by them to keep its bearing in foul weather where the common compass will not. The notice runs to 4 lines. There is no further follow-up in the paper. Whether Grafton went to the patent office in Washington in person or whether he filed by post through a Boston lawyer, the record of the application itself is not, so far as I have been able to determine, presently in the bound volumes I have searched. The filing is referenced in the Navy's procurement correspondence of 1832 by date and by the inventor's name, and that reference is the cleanest documentary anchor we have for the patent's existence. I have to make a small, honest aside here, because the patent record of the 1830s is a difficult one. The fire at the patent office in December 1836 destroyed the majority of the early American patent files in their original form. What survives is the restoration record, patents whose holders refiled copies of their drawings and specifications in the years after the fire. Charles Grafton did not refile. By the date of the restoration registry, he was already in failing circumstances. The result is that his patent exists as a citation in the Navy's procurement correspondence and as a reference number in the contemporary Boston papers. But his original drawings, as far as I can tell, did not survive the 1836 fire and were not redrawn afterwards. We are working, in other words, from the institutional buyer's side of the transaction, not the inventor's. What we do know about the compass itself comes from 3 sources. The first is the Boston Daily Advertiser's brief description from October 1830. The second is a longer descriptive paragraph in the procurement memorandum the Navy filed when it placed its order of 12 units in 1832. The third is the testimony of the ship's officers who used it, scattered through the logs of 3 frigates over the better part of a decade. From these, we can assemble a fair physical description, though the working mechanism Grafton claimed was at the heart of the device, is one of those things we will come back to and have to say honestly that we do not have. The compass card itself was conventional, a brass-rimmed paper disc, 32 points, a steel magnetized needle mounted on a hard agate pivot. The whole assembly suspended in the standard naval gimbal of the period. So far, an ordinary instrument. What was different was the assembly below the card. 3 small glass vials, each about 3 inches in length, sealed with wax and a lead cap. The vials contained, by the procurement memorandum, a quantity of refined quicksilver, the air above being expressed under careful pressure and sealed against admission. Beneath the vials was a counterweight system Grafton called the differential plate, a circular piece of figured brass machined with a series of concentric grooves, the function of which the memorandum does not explain because the procurement officer almost certainly did not understand it. The compass weighed substantially more than the standard binnacle compass it would replace. It required a deeper binnacle box. And by Grafton's own claim, supported by the captains who tried it in Boston Harbor in 1831, it would hold its bearing under sea states and ship motion conditions in which the standard compass became unreliable. This is the second place I have to be careful. There is a tradition in popular accounts of this story that has the Grafton compass operating on principles modern engineers do not understand, and producing readings that violate received physics. I want to be more measured than that. What the procurement records and the ship's logs support is the simpler and more interesting claim that Grafton had found, by trial and error in a sail loft, a damping arrangement for a compass card in heavy weather that was substantially better than what the Royal Navy and the United States Navy were using as standard issue. He had built, in effect, a mercury-damped, fluid vial compass, 30 years before the principle was formally introduced into European naval service by Kelvin and others in the 1870s. He had done it, not through theory, but through the iterative habits of a man who built sails for a living and was used to thinking about how a flexible material behaved under load. The unusual element, the one that does not survive, is the specific preparation of the mercury vials. By the procurement memorandum, the air above the quicksilver was expressed under careful pressure and sealed. What pressure, prepared how, with what tooling, in what sequence, that is the part that did not make the document. In April of 1832, the Navy Department in Washington sent a procurement officer to Boston to examine Grafton's compasses and report. The officer's name is given in the surviving correspondence as Lieutenant Joseph Tatnall, though I cannot find any further career trace for a Lieutenant Tatnall of that initial in the published Navy registers, and the name may have been recorded by a clerk who heard it once and never again. The lieutenant spent 3 days in Grafton's loft. He took 2 compasses aboard a small Navy sloop and ran them in the harbor for an afternoon in moderately rough conditions. His report, summarized in the procurement memorandum that followed, recommended the purchase of 12 units for trial deployment to the Atlantic Squadron. The price recorded was $120 per unit, which was a substantial sum for a mariner's instrument in 1832, roughly 4 times the cost of a standard naval compass of the same era. The Navy paid it. The 12 compasses were delivered to the Brooklyn Navy Yard in July 1832. They were distributed shortly afterwards to the Constitution, the Constellation, and the United States, 4 to each frigate. Here I have to make another self-correction, because I have been calling the second ship the Constellation throughout, and there is a confusion in the historical record that is worth getting right. There were, across the long American century, 2 famous warships of that name. There was the original frigate Constellation, launched in 1797, one of the original 6 frigates of the Federal Navy. And there is the sloop of war, Constellation, launched in 1854, which now lies as a museum ship in Baltimore. The two have been conflated for so long and so persistently that even the museum ship's own placards in Baltimore once carried claims that belong properly to her predecessor. The Grafton compasses, in the time frame we are looking at, would have been carried by the original frigate of 1797. She was still in commission in the 1830s, was given her major reconstruction at Charlestown Navy Yard in the 33 to 34 overhaul, was recommissioned in 1835, and served thereafter in the Mediterranean Squadron under squadron rotations that brought her back across the Atlantic on more than one occasion in the period we are looking at. The original frigate was eventually retired late in the long American century. Most of her timbers were burned or sold for firewood. None of her instruments survived the breaking. The Grafton compasses she carried, like the rest of her fittings, did not outlive her by any documentary trace I have been able to find. The first witness demonstration of the Grafton compass aboard a working United States warship took place on the 3rd of September, 1832, in Boston Harbor, with the Constitution at anchor and the procurement officer aboard. The demonstration was simple and brutal. A boat crew rowed the frigate's launch out to a point about a quarter-mile off the bow. They carried with them a heavy weight of iron, 3 sledgehammer heads, by the boatkeeper's note in his loose journal, and at a signal from the deck, they dropped the iron into the boat in such a way as to set up a violent rolling and pitching motion. They held the boat in that motion for 10 minutes. In the launch, 2 compasses were mounted, a standard naval binnacle compass and one of Grafton's units. 2 midshipmen recorded readings every 15 seconds. The standard compass, by the boatkeeper's note, wandered through near half the rows and recovered only with the cessation of the motion. The Grafton compass, in the same conditions, held its bearing within 2 points of north throughout the agitation and recovered to true on the instant of stillness. There were 6 witnesses. The procurement officer signed off on the test that afternoon. The frigate took her 4 compasses to sea 3 weeks later, bound for the Caribbean station. It is worth pausing here on the small detail of those iron sledgehammer heads, because there is a particular kind of cleverness in it that suggests the kind of mind Grafton was. A binnacle compass is more sensitive to iron near it than to motion. The standard 19th century complaint about a compass at sea was not that it could not handle a swell, the gimbal handled the swell, but that the iron in the ship herself, in her guns and her fittings and her cargo, deflected the needle in ways that varied with the ship's heading. Grafton's launch test included the iron deliberately, because he wanted the procurement officer to see that the differential plate beneath his compass card was correcting for the iron's deflection as the boat rolled. The test was, in other words, not a test of damping alone, but a test of self-correction for ferrous interference. The Constitution carried, by her gun list for 1832, 44 iron-mounted long guns and a heavy iron stove in her galley. She was a floating bar of iron with sails on top. The standard compass at sea in such a ship was a notoriously imperfect instrument. The Grafton compass, by every reference in her log over the next 6 years, was not. Her first sailing under the new instrument took her south to the West Indies in late September of 1832. The captain's log for that cruise survives in the Navy's archive at Washington, and I have read what is available in the public extract. There is no reference to the new compass in the first week of sailing. By the second week, the officer of the deck has begun making routine comparison notes between the 2 instruments in the binnacle. By the third week, when the frigate was running before a strong gale north of Hispaniola, the log entry for the night of the 11th of October reads in the abbreviated language of a watch officer at 3 in the morning. Wind backed 2 points in the squall, the standard run round to north by east by north. The Grafton holding true at north-northeast. Course held by the Grafton, sea state heavy. It is the first of what will become more than 70 similar entries scattered through the logs of the 3 frigates over the next 6 years. Whatever Grafton had built, the men using it in working conditions trusted it more than they trusted the standard issue of their service. That is not a small thing. Sailors of the 1830s did not trust new instruments easily. They had been drowned by new instruments before. To understand what happened to the Grafton compasses in 1839, it is necessary to step back from the squadron rotations and walk into the offices of the United States Navy in Washington as they existed in the early 1830s. The Navy Department occupied a small group of plain brick buildings near the President's house, what we now call the White House. The Secretary of the Navy in the year the compasses were ordered was Levi Woodbury, a New Hampshire lawyer who held the post from May of 1831 until June of 1834. Woodbury was a careful administrator, not a sailor. The procurement officer who recommended Grafton's compasses was reporting up to a man who, by his own correspondence, took the recommendation of his uniformed officers at something close to face value. The order of 12 compasses, by the standards of Navy procurement at the time, was a minor file. It would have crossed Woodbury's desk for signature and gone no further up. What sat on that desk, alongside the Grafton procurement, is worth describing. The mariner's compass of the 1830s was a settled instrument, by which I mean it had been settled for nearly a century. The standard British naval pattern, a steel needle on an agate pivot, a brass-bound paper card, a gimbaled binnacle, had been refined by a sequence of London instrument makers across the latter 18th century, building on Gowan Knight's earlier work on the magnetized needle, and by the slow, practical iteration of the Admiralty's Compass Committee through the Napoleonic Wars. By 1830, the standard British compass and the standard American compass were near identical instruments, differing only in the color of the rose and the maker's mark on the bezel. The American Navy bought its compasses from a small number of Boston and Philadelphia instrument makers who built to specification. Each compass was tested at the Brooklyn Navy Yard before issue. Each was expected to give reliable bearings in normal sea states and to require regular remagnetization of the needle after periods of heavy weather. There were known weaknesses. The needle deflected near iron. The cards swung wildly in extreme conditions. Compasses near the magazine, where the iron content of the ship was concentrated, were nearly useless in close quarters. None of these weaknesses were considered scandalous. They were considered the nature of the instrument. I want to be precise about one common misunderstanding here, because the popular telling of this story leans on the cliché that 19th century compasses drifted constantly and that any improvement would have been seized upon as miraculous. The truth is more textured. In ordinary weather, with the ship on a steady course, the standard binnacle compass of 1832 was a perfectly serviceable instrument. A skilled navigator with a working chronometer and a good chart could keep his position to within a few miles over a transatlantic crossing. The compass was a tool, like a sextant, and good sailors knew its limitations and worked around them. The Grafton's advantage was not that it made bad navigators good. The Grafton's advantage was that it kept its bearing during the conditions in which good navigators most needed bearings: heavy weather, sudden squalls, the moments when sail had to be reduced and the ship's head brought into the wind, the moments when an error of 2 compass points could put a ship onto a lee shore or into a French reef. It was, in the language of the day, a foul-weather instrument. The Royal Navy of 1832 did not have one. The Admiralty's Compass Committee had been recommending, for nearly a decade, the development of a damped compass on principles similar to Grafton's, and had been failing to find an instrument maker willing to take on the work at a price the service could afford. The British were not producing a superior pattern in 1832. They were producing the same pattern they had been producing in 1792, with minor refinements to the cardamatic engraving. The full British shift to a damped, fluid compass, what we now call the Kelvin pattern, did not come until the late 1870s, and the conventional textbook chronology of the instrument places the modern damped compass in that decade, not in the 1830s. The Royal Navy, that the Secretary of the Navy's correspondence would later cite as the source of superior designs, was, on the documentary record, more than 40 years behind Grafton in the matter of compass damping. I first looked at the compass logs of the original Constitution in the National Archives extract in 2012. I have gone back to them periodically since. They are not easy reading. The watch entries of an American frigate of the 1830s are written in a compressed, penciled hand, with abbreviations whose meaning has to be learnt slowly, and with a tone of professional restraint that does not flag what is unusual. You have to read for it. The Grafton compass enters the log not as a novelty, but as a normalized second instrument, referenced by the same shorthand the watch used for any other piece of standard kit. And you only realize, after the third or fourth reading, that the men using it had built a habit of trusting it to a degree they did not trust the standard instrument beside it. The habit was, by all the marks of it, a quiet one. There was no enthusiasm in the log. There was no praise. There was, in entry after entry, a small phrase that meant, in the language of a watch officer, that the day's work had been done. In the autumn of 1835, the Constitution put back into Norfolk for refit. Her timbers were sound. Her standing rigging was being replaced. Her 4 Grafton compasses were taken below for routine inspection by the ship's gunner, who in that period was responsible also for the binnacle instruments. The gunner's name was William Forrest, by the muster of November 1835. He had been with the ship for 9 years. He had taken the 4 Grafton compasses out of their binnacle boxes twice a year for as long as the ship had carried them. He had never opened the mercury vial assembly. He had never been instructed how. The vials, sealed with wax and lead, were the part of the instrument the inspecting officer was to inspect by sight only, looking for cracks in the glass or seepage of quicksilver, and not by touch. Forrest's inspection notes from November 1835 record all 4 units as sound. He signed his name. He put the compasses back into their boxes. He did not know, because nobody had told him, that one of those vials had begun to develop a hairline fracture along its seal line, and would, in the heavy weather the frigate met 2 months later off the Carolinas, fail. The midshipman of the morning watch, on the 21st of January 1836, was a young man whose name I will keep out of this telling, because the documentary extract I have read of his personal log was published anonymously in a private New England family history in the 1870s, and the family asked then for the name to remain pseudonymous. I will call him, as the family history does, M. He was 18 years old. He had been at sea for 9 months. The watch he stood at 4 in the morning of that day was his second night watch since the frigate had cleared Cape Hatteras, heading north, and the weather, which had been moderate when he came on deck, had built through his watch into a heavy squall, with rain that pelted in over the quarterdeck rail like grape shot. By 5:30, with the frigate driving north before a wind that had backed 2 points in the dark and was building toward gale strength, M was standing at the binnacle with the captain of the watch, comparing the two compasses by the swinging light of the binnacle lamp. The standard compass was reading north by east. The Grafton compass, on the same binnacle, was reading north-northeast and had been holding that bearing for the previous 20 minutes. They were 2.5 compass points apart. The captain of the watch, who had used the Grafton for 3 years and the standard compass for 15, ordered the helm corrected to the Grafton's reading. He did this by M's private journal entry written later that morning, with no apparent reflection, as though the choice between the two were already long made. I want to sit with that small moment, because it is the human center of this whole story. A frigate of the United States Navy was running before a winter gale north of the Carolinas in 1836, and an officer of the watch, a man with no theoretical training in compass design, who had never met Charles Grafton, who would not have been able to explain in any technical detail why one of the two compasses on the binnacle was more reliable than the other, was casually, by long habit, betting his ship and the lives of 350 men aboard her on the reading of the heavier instrument. He was right to do so. 3 hours later, when the squall passed and the weather settled, and they were able to take an observation, the frigate was within a mile of her dead reckoning by the Grafton's bearing. By the standard compass's bearing, she would have been 23 miles east of her intended track and closing on a known shoal off Diamond Bank. M's journal records that the captain of the watch went below at the end of the morning watch, drank a cup of coffee in the wardroom in silence, and said only one thing, which M wrote down in his own hand. If they take that instrument off this ship, I will buy one with my own money. The captain of the watch never did buy one with his own money. He was rotated to a sloop the following year. The Grafton compass that had held the bearing through the Diamond Bank squall, one of 4 aboard the Constitution, was, by the inventory list at the Brooklyn Navy Yard in May 1839, smashed with a sledgehammer in the open courtyard of the yard alongside her 3 sister units. The hairline fracture in the vial seal that the gunner Forrest had not detected in November 1835 had, by all the documentary evidence we can put together, not in fact developed into a failure. The compass continued to work for another 3 years after that inspection. What did fail was something further up the chain of command. By the summer of 1837, in the Navy Department offices in Washington, a different kind of inspection was beginning to take place. It was conducted not on the instruments themselves, but on the procurement file that had brought them into the fleet 5 years earlier. And it was conducted by a man who had recently taken office as Secretary of the Navy, and who had begun to look with the suspicion of a new administrator inheriting an old file, at the question of what exactly the United States had paid $120 a unit to buy. It is worth taking the question into the Boston sail loft for a moment before we walk into Washington and into Malin Dickerson's office. Charles Grafton, in 1837, was 53 years old. He had moved out of the loft above Long Wharf 3 years earlier and was working from a smaller upstairs room 2 streets back from the water, where the rent was cheaper and the light through the windows was worse, but the noise from the harbor was less. He had stopped taking sail work entirely by then. He was living by the scattered references in the city directory and in 2 letters to a Boston merchant captain, whose correspondence was later catalogued by his family, on the dwindling residual of what the Navy had paid him in 1832, and on the occasional sale of a compass to a private merchant master. He was, by his own description, in one of those 2 letters, occupied entirely now with the further development of the differential plate, in such a measure as my present circumstances will allow. He was preparing the mercury vials by hand. He had no assistant. He had no apprentice. He had never written down the preparation in any sequence that another man could follow. I stood once outside the building that occupies the lot where his second loft is supposed to have stood. It is a modern brick warehouse now, with a coffee shop on the ground floor. The Boston city directories of the 1830s locate his rooms approximately, but the original wooden structure was demolished in the 1860s, and the lot has been built over twice since. There is no plaque. There is nothing to look at. I mention this only because the question of where a man worked when he prepared a thing that another man could not later prepare is a question I have come back to in this kind of research more times than I can count, and the answer is almost always the same. There is nothing to look at. The building is gone. The bench is gone. The man who knew which angle to hold the lead cap to the glass while the air above the quicksilver was being expressed is gone. The man who replaced Levi Woodbury as Secretary of the Navy in June 1834 was a New Jersey lawyer named Dickerson. He held the post for 4 years, until the summer of 1838, when ill health forced his resignation. Dickerson is not, by the standards of 19th-century cabinet officers, a famous figure. He had been senator from New Jersey before his appointment. He had no naval background. He took the post at the request of Andrew Jackson and continued under Martin Van Buren. By the published correspondence of his tenure, Dickerson was a careful, skeptical administrator, a man who treated unusual procurement files with the alertness of a country lawyer reading a contract he did not draft. The Grafton procurement of 1832, by the time Dickerson came to look at it 5 years later, was not an obviously unusual file. The compasses had been bought, deployed, and reported on by their using officers in entirely positive terms. There were no complaints in the file. There were no requests for repair or replacement. There were, by the documentary anchor I have been able to confirm, only the original procurement memorandum and the 7 years of routine entries in the squadron's logs. What put the Grafton file onto Dickerson's desk in the spring of 1838 was, in the simplest reading, a question of money. The Navy was being asked to buy a further 16 units. The request had come up through the squadron's commanding officer in February 1838, a routine recommendation that the using officer's positive experience with the original 12 compasses justified extending the procurement to the entire active frigate fleet, an additional 16 units at the same price per unit. The total cost of the proposed additional purchase was $1,920. By Navy procurement standards of 1838, that was, again, a minor file. It would normally have been signed off in a week. It was not signed off. Dickerson held it. He asked, in a memorandum that appears as a referenced extract in the later naval correspondence of the autumn of 1838, whether the department had on file any technical specification of the proposed instrument, any documentation of the means by which it produced the performance claimed by the using officers, any patent drawing he could consult. The reply, by the department's bureau head, was that the patent drawing had not survived the 1836 Patent Office fire, that the inventor had not refiled, that the only technical specification the department held was the original procurement memorandum of 1832, and that the bureau head was not, on reflection, able to explain to the secretary in any technical detail by what principle the differential plate beneath the compass card operated. I want to put down here, as carefully as I can, what we know about the letter Dickerson then wrote, because this is the place where the popular telling of this story departs from what the documentary record will actually support. There is a letter from the Secretary of the Navy, dated to the spring of 1838, that has been quoted in extract by a small number of 19th-century maritime historians, and that appears as a footnote in two 20th-century surveys of naval instrument procurement. The original of that letter, so far as I have been able to determine, is not now in the publicly indexed Dickerson papers at the New Jersey Historical Society. What is quoted of it is short, 3 sentences in the cleanest extract, perhaps 4 in the longest version cited in a footnote. The substance of the quoted portion is the recommendation that the department cease the use of the Grafton compasses pending an investigation into their operational principles, that no further units be purchased, and that the existing 12 units be withdrawn from service. The phrase used in the extract is concerning reports regarding the Grafton devices, and I want to be honest that I cannot reconstruct from the extract alone what the concerning reports were. They may have been technical, they may have been financial, they may have been, as has sometimes been suggested in the popular accounts, religious or institutional, a discomfort with an instrument no department engineer could explain. I am not in a position to choose between those readings on the documentary evidence I have. I can only say that the recommendation was made and that it was followed. The recall order went out from Washington in late June 1838. By August, the 4 units aboard the Constitution had been crated and dispatched to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. By October, the 4 aboard the Constellation, the original frigate of 1797 on the West India Station, had been recalled to Norfolk. By the close of the year, the 4 aboard the United States had come home. All 12 compasses were assembled by January 1839 at the Brooklyn Yard. They were placed in a single storeroom under the eye of the yard's gunnery officer, pending further instruction from the department on what was to be done with them. The further instruction, when it came, was unusual. The compasses were not to be returned to the inventor. They were not to be sold for scrap, which would have been the normal disposition of obsolete naval equipment. They were not to be retained for study by the department's Bureau of Instruments, which would have been the normal disposition of a unique technical asset. They were to be destroyed. The order, dated to the spring of 1839 and signed by Dickerson's successor as acting secretary, by this point Dickerson had resigned for reasons of health, specified that each unit was to be broken up beyond recovery in the open courtyard of the Brooklyn Yard, in the presence of 2 officers, and the broken components disposed of in such a manner that they could not be reassembled or reconstructed. The mercury was to be reclaimed. The brass was to be returned to the foundry stocks. The glass vials and the differential plates were to be smashed, and the fragments mixed with general yard rubbish. The order does not give a reason for the unusual specification of complete destruction. The reason, whatever it was, did not make the document. It was carried out on the 4th of May, 1839. The yard officer, detailed to oversee the destruction, is identified in the secondary literature on the case as one of the Navy's lieutenants of the period, a small detail to which I will return in a moment, because I am not in a position to confirm the name to my own satisfaction. The breaking up was, by the brief yard officer's note that has been quoted in extract by later researchers, conducted in the open courtyard of the yard, with 2 officers in attendance, in compliance with the department's order of march. 12 units were broken. The mercury was reclaimed. The brass was returned to the foundry stocks. The glass and the figured plate were smashed, and the fragments disposed of as instructed. The yard officer's note, in the form in which it has been quoted, contains a single line of mild bafflement to the effect that the manner of disposal specified by the department was unusual, and the necessity for it was not understood by the officers carrying it out. I want to set down honestly that the original of the yard officer's note, if it survives, is held in the manuscript holdings of one of the federal archives, but that I have not myself sat with the original document. What I have read is the extract reproduced in the secondary literature. The name commonly attached to the supervising officer in that secondary literature is the name of a lieutenant who would, the following year, take command of a famous Pacific expedition. I do not want to attach that name to this incident without having confirmed it from the primary record, because it would be unfair to a real officer to have him bear, on my account, the historical weight of an event whose only documentary trace is a secondary extract. I will simply say that an officer of the yard supervised the destruction, that he expressed in writing his bafflement at the order, and that the order was carried out. Dickerson, by then, was in retirement in New Jersey and was not in a position to be asked. It is worth pausing here to notice the pattern. Grafton's mercury preparation, lost. Lomonosov's spring tension, lost. Cayley's hand-stitched fabric, gone. Stringfellow's brazed copper joints, never written down. Hutchison's electrolyte preparation, gone with him 3 days after the funeral. Across the documentary record of the Patent Office of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, in 5 countries over the better part of 100 years, the same hole appears in the same place every time. The drawing survives, the witness survives, the performance survives in the test report. The small material trick that made the assembly actually work at the weights and the durations and the pressures the inventor claimed. That small trick, in instance after instance, is the part of the record that does not survive. The Grafton case is a sharper version of this pattern than most, because in his case, the working instruments themselves were known, were used by named officers in named ships for 7 years, and were then taken out and broken up by deliberate institutional action. The other cases of dispersed papers and burnt workshops can be read, if one wishes to read them charitably, as the ordinary attrition of a century. The Grafton case is harder to read that way. The destruction was ordered. The order was signed. The reason did not make the file. Modern attempts to reverse engineer the Grafton compass from the surviving procurement memorandum and the contemporary newspaper notice have been few. The instrument is not a famous one. There is no science museum reconstruction of it on the Stringfellow model. There is no engineering centenary that has put a research budget against rebuilding it from the documents. The 2 attempts I have been able to find traces of were both private. One by a retired Royal Navy navigation officer in the 1970s, working from photocopies of the procurement memorandum and the Boston Daily Advertiser notice, and one by a graduate student in instrument history at Williams College in the late 1980s, whose master's thesis I have read in the library extract. Both reconstructions managed to build a working, mercury-damped compass on what they understood to be Grafton's general principle. Both compasses worked better than the standard early 19th century binnacle. Neither matched the performance the Constitution's log entries describe. The Williams student's thesis is unusually frank on this point. I have rebuilt what I believe is the broad form of Grafton's device, she writes in her conclusion, and have tested it in conditions that approximate the heavy weather of the 1830s Atlantic. The instrument works. It is better than a standard period compass. It is not as good as the Constitution's officers' logs say Grafton's compasses were. There is something in the vial preparation or in the differential plate's geometry that I have not been able to recover from the surviving documents, and that I suspect is not recoverable. That is, in the end, the cleanest summary I can give of where the documentary record leaves the question. The compasses were ordered, they were used, they were destroyed. The man who built them was dead within 2 years of the destruction, on the wrong side of an international border, under circumstances that have to be examined separately. The drawing is gone. The bench is gone. The hand that prepared the mercury vials is gone. What survives is the procurement memorandum, the 7 years of log entries, the brief letter extract, and the broken fragments that were swept up in the courtyard of the Brooklyn Navy Yard on the 4th of May, 1839, and mixed with the general yard rubbish for cartage. The man who built the compasses left Boston in February 1840. He sold what was left of his second-floor loft contents to a Boston instrument maker named Phineas Doolittle, whose receipt for the transaction survives in the Doolittle Papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and which I have read in extract. The receipt lists 2 finished compasses of the Grafton pattern, one in the partly assembled state, a quantity of brass and figured plate, 3 boxes of small glass vials, sealed and unsealed, a quantity of refined quicksilver in stoppered jars, and various tools. Doolittle paid Grafton $78.50 for the lot. The 2 finished compasses Doolittle later sold to a merchant master out of Salem for $140 the pair, which suggests Doolittle understood the value of what he had bought, and Grafton, by this point, did not. The partly assembled compass Doolittle is recorded as having broken down for parts within a year. The brass and the figured plate were melted into Doolittle's own stocks. The glass vials and the quicksilver were used in the preparation of standard mercurial barometers, which were the bulk of Doolittle's trade. By 1841, nothing recognizable of Grafton's working materials remained in Doolittle's shop. Grafton sailed from Boston for Veracruz in February 1840. The reason he gave for the move, in his last surviving Boston letter to the merchant captain, whose correspondence I have referred to earlier, was that he had been offered work, or rather, his words were that I have had an inquiry from a party in that country, by an unnamed party who desires the application of the differential plate to the chronometer rather than the compass, and who has the means to support the trial. It is impossible to say now who the inquirer was. The Mexican Republic of 1840 was in a difficult condition. The country had lost Texas 4 years earlier. It was facing the early stages of what would become the prolonged conflict with the French. The Pastry War of 1838 had only recently been settled, and there was little money for instrument development in any institutional sense. The inquiry Grafton was responding to may have been from a private merchant. It may have been from a naval officer of the Mexican fleet looking to procure better chronometers. It may have been a fabrication, Grafton telling a friend he was sailing for a reason, when in truth He was sailing because Boston had become impossible to remain in. I do not know. What we know is that he arrived in Veracruz in late March 1840, that he traveled inland by stages to Mexico City, that he took rooms in a small boarding house in the western quarter of the city, and that he died there on the 23rd of August, 1840, of causes that the local authorities described in the brief published notice of the death as indeterminate, but consistent with a violent action upon his person. There was no public inquest. There was no funeral attended by anyone whose name has come down to us. He was buried in a Catholic cemetery in the western quarter of the city. Grafton had not been Catholic, but the boarding house keeper made the arrangements, and the records of the cemetery from that year have not survived intact. The grave is not now identifiable. The boarding house no longer stands. The boarding house keeper's testimony, recorded in a Boston paper that picked up the death notice 3 months later, said only that Grafton had been in poor health throughout the summer, that he had received few visitors, that 2 men of unfamiliar appearance had called upon him on the evening of the 22nd, and that he had been found dead in his bed at midday on the 23rd. The boarding house keeper, by the same testimony, was uncertain whether to characterize the death as the result of those visitors or as an unrelated coincidence of timing. He preferred, by his last published remark on the matter, not to characterize it at all. The Boston papers carried the notice. The Navy did not. There is no reference to the death of the inventor in any naval correspondence of the period that I have been able to identify. The compasses had been gone from the fleet for 16 months by the time he died. The procurement file had been closed. The matter, from the Navy's side, was finished. I want to come back, here at the end, to the small image with which this story properly begins, because the documentary record begins with the procurement officer's report in Boston Harbor in 1832. But the human shape of it begins 3 months earlier in the upstairs loft off Long Wharf, where Charles Grafton was at his bench, preparing the mercury vials for the 12 compasses he had just been commissioned to build. He worked, by every reference I have been able to find, alone. He worked in the evenings by the light of a single oil lamp. He held each vial in his left hand, the lead cap in his right, the small piece of figured brass that was the seal press resting on the bench beside him. He had a particular way of holding the cap at an angle to the vial's mouth, while the air above the quicksilver was being expressed, and the seal press was being brought down. He had developed this way over a period of perhaps 3 years of trial and error, working from a habit of hand and an instinct for material that did not require an explanation to himself, and that he never set down on paper for anyone else. He produced 12 compasses for the Navy in the spring of 1832. He produced a small number of additional units in the years following, perhaps 20 in total by the references I have been able to assemble. Each of the working units in the 8 years